Welcome back. So I'm wearing I got this from Geeky Jerseys. It's a Thanos Titans jersey because in less than a month's time, Gary Bettman will snap his fingers and half the NHL teams aren't playing anymore. Well, roughly half. It's 15 out of 31. So next year it'll be a true Thanos where half of them are snapped out of existence, at least for a while. Not completely, but just till next year. You can go golfing. Check with your local health. Just maybe you can go golfing. So, yeah, I want to discuss the playoff picture as it stands right now and the schedule as it stands right now. And yeah, Vancouver's gonna have a rough time of it. And that's the key thing here is that yes, there's an interesting storyline going on with the North, but the top four teams in the North should remain the top four teams in the North right through from now until a month from now, right? So we'll start off with Toronto, where of course everybody is understanding it's just a couple of games. It's just a 5-game set. It's not. No? Okay. All right. So upcoming, they have 2 at Winnipeg. They have 1 at Montreal. So the next 3 games, if they lose those 3 games, then it's the perfect time to panic. Then they're at home against Vancouver for 2. They go to Montreal for 1. They're home against Montreal for 2. So the Habs and the Leafs can go a long way to deciding, A, whether or not the Leafs end up finishing first in that division, and B, whether or not Montreal has anything to worry about from a team behind them. Because if Toronto wins those games against Montreal, that's going to make things more difficult for the Montreal Canadiens, right? There's 1 at Ottawa, and there's 1 at Winnipeg to end the season. That game against Winnipeg to end the season, maybe that decides who finishes first. So 7 out of their 10 games are against teams that are above the playoff line. And I'm not worried about who's below and who's above and getting into percentages. I decided, no, not going to do that. So I'm just going with who's above the line right now. It's just easier that way than getting into all the, okay, points percentage-wise. No, we're not going to do that. Winnipeg. So Winnipeg has 45 games played, 57 points. They're 4 points behind Toronto. Now they've got the 2 games at home against Toronto. And yes, odds are Winnipeg, seeing what happened in Vancouver, they're probably licking their chops and thinking whether Riddick's in net or Campbell's in net, we're in good shape. Right? Now, it's possible Jack Campbell gets on another hot streak as well. Don't forget, Campbell did have a really good hot streak there. After those 2 against Toronto, they're then at home against Edmonton for 2. They're at Montreal for 1, at Ottawa for 1, at Calgary for 1. So that's an interesting 3-game road trip through 3 different cities. And then they're at home against Ottawa for 1, at home against Vancouver for 2, and then at home against Toronto for 1. Again, the 2 against Toronto upcoming, the 1 at the end of the season. If they can sweep all 3, really good chance at finishing first. 6 of their final 11 games are against teams above the line. So technically, their schedule a little bit easier if you go by that line than Toronto's. Oilers, 44 games played, 56 points. So they have 2 games in hand on the Toronto Maple Leafs and they're 5 points back. They are not out of this. They have 1 at home against Montreal. They have 2 at Winnipeg, and then they have 2 at home against Calgary before they then see Vancouver a lot. They go to Vancouver for 2. They're at home against Vancouver for 2. They get 2 in Montreal, and then they have to finish their season against Vancouver. So only 5 of their 12 remaining games are against teams that are above that line. So if the Canucks are going to actually make this, we got a chip on our shoulder, we're going to do this. If they're actually going to make this work, they have to beat the Oilers, and they have to do it a lot. And that's going to be a tall task, right? So, yeah, 5 out of 12 are against teams above the playoff line, which tells you the Oilers are still in this hunt for first place. The one thing hurting them, they don't have any direct games against Toronto. They do have 2 at Winnipeg. Montreal. Montreal has no access to the Canucks over the rest of the season. They can't widen their lead and anything. So what they have to do, they go to Edmonton for 1, they go to Calgary for 3. Those 4 games right there could go a long way for them. Then they're at home against Toronto. They're at home against Winnipeg. They're at home against Ottawa. And then they have another one at home against Toronto before going to Ottawa. All of those 1-game sets. So prepare for that 1 game, move on. Then they're in Toronto for 2, and then they're at home against Edmonton for 2. What's interesting is 8 of their final 13 games are against teams above the playoff line. And of the other games, 2 of those are against Ottawa, who they've had trouble with, right? So it is not an easy ride from here if you're the Montreal Canadiens, plus Carey Price injured, right? So there are some reasons to look at this if you're below the line and say maybe. And for Calgary, it starts with the 3 games at home against Montreal. They need to win all 3. They have to win all 3, and they have to do it in regulation. They really want to make this interesting. That's what they absolutely have to do. Then they go to Edmonton for 2. They're at home against Winnipeg for 1. They're against Ottawa for 1, Vancouver for 1. They have 2 in Vancouver and then 1 at home against Vancouver, meaning their last 4 games are all against the Canucks. They can eliminate the Canucks from the playoffs. They can secure themselves potentially a playoff spot, because while they're doing that, Montreal finishes out their season at Toronto and at home against Edmonton for their Final Four. So, again, while it looks like things are probably pretty secure, maybe not. So for Calgary, 6 of their final 11 games are against teams above the playoff line. Vancouver, they have 2 against Ottawa at home, and then they go to Ottawa for 2. So those are 4 games right there, right? But gets much more difficult after that. And if they overlook Ottawa, that's when you take one on the chin. So they go to Toronto for 2. They're at home against Edmonton for 2. They go to Edmonton for 2. That 6-game set is going to be brutal. Toronto is going to bounce back from those 2 losses in Vancouver. The home team has won all meetings in that season series so far this year. And so, we'll see how that goes. Then they have 2 at Winnipeg. We know how they play against Winnipeg. Then they go to Calgary. They go to Edmonton. And then they finish off the season with 2 at home against Calgary and 1 in Calgary. So, 4 of their final 5 are against Calgary. That other game's against Edmonton, meaning it's while Calgary is resting up for another game against Vancouver. 9 of the 17 games remaining for the Canucks are against teams above the line. It will not be easy. Washington. So we're going to the East now. 62 points in 46 games for the Capitals, the same total as the Islanders have. 6 of their final 10 games are against teams above the line. They're at home against the Islanders for 2, and then they go, or they're in playing against New York Islanders for 2. Then they come home for 1 against the Islanders. That 3-game set is huge, and I'm sure Pittsburgh and Boston fans are going to be like, "Can you guys beat each other up and not go to overtime?" Great, thanks. Then there's 2 at home against Pittsburgh, 2 at the New York Rangers, 2 against Philadelphia at home, and then they end the season with 1 at home against Boston, which, with the way Boston's playing right now, could end up being one that decides playoff positioning. For the Islanders have a bit of an easier time. So they have the 3 games against Washington, right? 2 at home and 1 on the road. Then they're in New York against the Rangers. Then they're at home against the Rangers. Those are 1-game sets each. Then they have 2 at Buffalo, 2 at home against New Jersey, and then their last game of the season is at Boston. So Boston gets to decide things for the Islanders, maybe. But the Islanders have 4 games in a row that are against 2 teams that aren't playing for anything in New Jersey and Buffalo, and only 4 of their final 10 games are against teams above the line. The Islanders are in very good shape. If they win the games that they're supposed to against the Rangers, Buffalo, and New Jersey, that's 6 games right there. Pittsburgh, 46 games, 61 points. They are right there. They are right on the verge, and we can just forget about last night's game and how sloppy that was. Their next 2 are against New Jersey as well. They're at home for those. Then they're at home against Boston for 2. In Washington for 2, at Philly for 2, and then they're at home against Buffalo for 2. Only 4 of their last 10 games are against teams above the playoff line as well. So again, Pittsburgh could be a dark horse to finish first. It is possible. They have enough games left against New Jersey and Buffalo that it's possible. Then you got Boston. Boston, 58 points in 44 games. They don't have very many games left against teams above the playoff line either. So I feel bad for New Jersey and Buffalo right now because the rest of their schedule, kind of brutal. So for the Bruins, they're now at Buffalo for 2. They're at Pittsburgh for 2. Then they come home and play against Buffalo for 2. They go to New Jersey for 2. They're at home against the Rangers for 2. And then they finish out their season with that game at home against the Islanders. And then they go and play the Capitals in that final game. Only 4 of their final 12 games are against teams above the line. But there's an asterisk to that. New Jersey has given them headaches all year. New Jersey's absolutely driven them nuts. And that game last night against Buffalo, that was a little bit closer than maybe it should have been. So, yeah, we'll see. We'll see how things go for Boston from here. But and of course, the game before that, Boston wins in a shootout. So we'll see. New York Rangers. So they're at home against Philadelphia for 2. They're at home against Buffalo for 2. They've got 1 at home against the Islanders, 1 at the Islanders, 2 against the Washington Capitals. They're at home for those, and then they go to Boston for 2. It is a tough schedule for them because 6 of their final 10 are against teams above the line. They have the 2 at Boston, so they have access to Boston. However, they do have 2 less games left to play than Boston, and Boston's been playing very well. So, kind of a rough go for the Rangers. I think they're probably done. But if they can win both games against Philly and hope Boston struggles against Buffalo, both of those games end up being kind of close, so we'll see. So we'll move over to the Western Division, and you've got the Vegas Golden Knights, 45 games, 66 points for them. They're leading the way. They're actually number one in the NHL at this point. That's that dreaded President's Trophy, right? That'll snap you out too. Thanos like, oh, you won the President's Trophy. Stop snapping your fingers. Never. Even use it for chips. Why are you using it to get fries? That's such a waste of Infinity Stones. So, they have one versus San Jose, and I feel bad for the Sharks on this because the Sharks have a brutal schedule. Then they're in Anaheim for one. They're at home against Colorado for two. They're at Arizona for two. At Minnesota for two. At home against St. Louis for two. And then at San Jose for one. Now, again, remember, I'm not qualifying St. Louis as being above the line. I'm qualifying Arizona as above the line because they are. And, six of the games are against playoff teams out of 11. But if we say, well, not Arizona, we'll say St. Louis instead, it's still 6 out of 11. So there you go. Same either way. Colorado. So Colorado coming out of their COVID pause, which it did not run through the team like it did Vancouver. They're back playing tomorrow. 3 postponed games, 2 at home against LA and 1 at St. Louis. So what's interesting with this is now factoring those games in, and they haven't been rescheduled yet. They will be. Other than that, they have 2 at St. Louis, 2 at Vegas, 2 at home against San Jose, 2 in San Jose, and 2 at LA. So they've got 4 games left against LA, 4 games left against San Jose, and the 2 against Vegas. If you can win both games against Vegas, and then you've got San Jose and LA 4 times each, Colorado probably wins the division. So Vegas wants to win both those games in regulation and make it as difficult for Colorado as possible. Otherwise, things are going to get interesting because they've played 2 less games and they've got 2 less points. So, bring it on. Minnesota, 44 games, 59 points. They've hung in this a lot longer than I think people figured they would. In terms of, they're still within shouting distance of first. They're not going to get first, but they're close, right? They're 7 points back of Vegas with a game in hand. They're 5 points back of Colorado. Colorado has a game in hand on them. They're at Arizona for 1, at LA for 1, at San Jose for 1. So this is normal NHL scheduling. It does show up once in a while. It's usually due to the pauses, though. Then there's 2 at home against St. Louis, 2 at St. Louis. So those are huge. St. Louis and Minnesota. So far, St. Louis has had the advantage in that series. If that continues, St. Louis probably makes the playoffs. 2 at home against Vegas. 2 at home against Anaheim, and then they finish the season with 1 against St. Louis. We'll see if that game ends up deciding St. Louis's playoff fate. Only 2 of their final 12 games are against teams that are currently above the playoff line. But again, if they struggle against St. Louis in those 5 games they have left, suddenly, or no, they've got 3 because Arizona is another one. So that's 3 out of 12. Either way, it's still 3 out of 12 against teams that are currently above the playoff line. We'll see whether or not St. Louis knocks them off. And then suddenly, if St. Louis is above that line, the whole thing changes, right? Arizona, 46 games, 45 points. They need to show they really want that spot. They need to show they really want it. And the good news is the schedule is pretty decent to them from here. They're at home against Minnesota for 1. Then they go to LA for 1. Then they're at San Jose for 2. So if they can hold their own against LA and San Jose, that goes a long way for them. Then they're at home against Vegas for 2. That's going to be tough. But then they're at home against LA for 2, and then they go to San Jose for 2. Of their last 9 games, 8 of them are against San Jose or LA. So 3 out of their final 10 games are against teams that are above the line. So yes, Arizona's had a rough time lately. The schedule would tell you that may change soon. St. Louis, 43 games played, 44 points. So they have 3 games in hand on Arizona. They're only 1 point back. Arizona needs to really pocket those points when they get the chance. But St. Louis has a really tough go of this. They have 1 game postponed at home against Colorado. But upcoming, they have 2 games at home against Colorado. Then they go to Minnesota for 2. They're at home against Minnesota for 2. At home against Anaheim for 2. They have 2 at Vegas. Then they're at LA for 1, and they're at Minnesota for 1. 10 of their final 13 games are against teams that are above this line. So again, if they can continue their mastery of Minnesota, they're in okay shape. But if they struggle in those games against Minnesota, it could be a bit of a tough haul. So again, while they have more games left to go, they have 3 games in hand on Arizona. They also have a much more difficult schedule, much more squash schedule too, right? San Jose, 45 games, 41 points. Well, they're done. Yeah, they're done. Every single game they have left is against a team above the playoff line. They're at Vegas for 1. They're at home against Minnesota for 1. Then they're at home against Arizona for 2. They're at Colorado for 2. They're at home against Colorado for 2. They're at home against Arizona for 2. And they're at home against Vegas for 1. So the good news is they're at home for the last 5 games. The bad news is they're against really good teams that are probably going to be trying to, lock down first place or second place or a playoff spot. And it just, it doesn't look good for San Jose. That's insane. LA, 43 games left, or they've played 43 games. They've got 40 points. They've got 13 games left. Now, their upcoming schedule is easy, and then it gets difficult after that. So they have 2 games postponed at Colorado. Those will likely get shoved to the end of the season, right? So they have 1 against Minnesota at home. Then they're at home against Arizona for 1. They're at home against Anaheim for 2. Winnable games. I mean, Minnesota, we'll see how they do against Minnesota. But Arizona and Anaheim, those are winnable games if they really want this spot in the playoffs. Then they go to Anaheim for 2. So again, they can get on a bit of a run, and then they're at Arizona for 2. If LA can show they can play Anaheim like they did last night, if they can do that against Arizona, there's a chance. But then they have 2 at home against Colorado and 1 at home against St. Louis. And again, those 2 postponed against Colorado in Colorado, that's 4 games left. How they play against the Avs will likely decide whether or not they really are still in this. 9 of their final 13 are against playoff teams above the line. Central Division, last division, promise, there aren't more divisions. Yet, right? So Carolina, 45 games, 65 points. So they're 1 point behind Vegas. They're tied with Florida. This division's been fantastic, and the race down to the final should be very interesting. It's not an overly difficult schedule for Carolina from here. They're at Florida for 2. They're at Dallas for 2. The games at Florida should be fantastic. Those should be wide open, great games. The games at Dallas is playing the kind of desperate hockey we've been waiting for all year. They're on a run. Dallas currently below the line because, again, if a team's below the line, I'm just leaving them there for right now. I'm not going by points percentage. And then they're at home against Detroit for 1. They're at home against Columbus for 1. They're at home against Chicago for 3. So if the Hawks are actually going to make it in the playoffs and somehow overcome all of this, they're going to have to win at least 2 of those 3 against Carolina, I would think. And then they have 2 left in Nashville. So the last 5 games Carolina plays could decide that final playoff spot one way or the other. Could knock Nashville out, give Dallas that spot. Could, if they fumble against Chicago, could have Chicago jump into that spot if they then beat Nashville. Carolina should be interesting, but only 4 of their last 11 games are against teams above the line. It's more difficult for Florida. Florida's got 9 games left. They're at home against Carolina for 2. Then they go to Nashville for 2. Then they have 2 at Chicago, 1 at home against Dallas, and then the 2 at home against Tampa to round out the season. So, of their final 9 games, 6 of them are against teams that are above the playoff line. Tampa, 46 games, 62 points for them. So they're 3 points back, and it's starting to look like Tampa probably going to finish 3rd in the division, and we'll see if that actually benefits them. Maybe, and again, to me, it feels like they're kind of just going through the motions, which a team when they've won a championship can do that, and then they figure they can turn it on in the playoffs, and maybe they can. Oh, I'm wearing the Thanos. I didn't just wipe out half of something, did I? If I find out when I wear this jersey, I snap my fingers and wipe out half of something, I'm going to be really upset. So Tampa, they're at home against Columbus for 2. They're in Chicago for 1. They're at home against Dallas for 1. They're at Detroit for 2. They're at home against Dallas for 2. And then they're in Florida for 2. So what's interesting with this is, again, remembering Dallas is currently below the line. They can keep Dallas there. They have 3 games against Dallas. The only team they play that's above the line now is Florida in those last 2 games of the season. They are done with Carolina. They are done with Nashville. They don't even have to play Chicago. So for Tampa, they don't have a lot of control over where other teams finish. But with a schedule like that, they have great control over where they finish. So they can't hurt the teams above them, but they can really help themselves with only 2 of those 10 final games against teams above the line. Nashville, their schedule, really interesting. We'll see how things go. They have the 2 more games at Chicago. They have 2 at home against Florida. They have 1 at home against Dallas, 2 at Columbus, and then 2 at home against Carolina. So They have the 2 against Florida, 2 against Carolina to finish out the season, but only 4 of their final 9 games are against teams above the playoff line. They do play Chicago twice. They do play Dallas once. They're going to need some help, though, to keep Dallas below that playoff line. So let's go to Dallas, who are just below the line. They have 2 games in hand on Nashville. They're only 1 point back. They're at home, or they're in Detroit for the next 2. Then they're at home against Carolina for 2. They go to Tampa Bay for 1. Those 3 games, to me, will tell us just how real Dallas is right now, and whether or not this is sustainable, and whether or not they're actually going to do this. And then they have 1 at Nashville, 1 at Florida, 2 at Tampa, and 2 at Chicago. This is not an easy schedule. 7 of their final 11 games are against teams above the line. They only have 1 shot at Nashville. They have 2 shots at Chicago. And other than that, they've got Florida, Tampa, and Carolina all in their schedule. So winning those other 2 games in Detroit is key for Dallas to keep this up. If they stumble in those 2 games, the whole storyline can change quickly. Chicago, 46 games, 47 points. Their odds of making the playoffs seem to drop with each passing week, just gradually, because that makes it harder and harder for fans, right? But their schedule, they have 2 at home against Nashville. They need to win both. Then they're at home against Tampa Bay for 2. They're at home against Florida for 1. They have 3 at Carolina. And then they have the 2 at home against Dallas. If they can hold their own against the better teams in the division, and the reality is they had trouble with that, so they went from being, pretty much a sure thing for 4th place to being, well, they're not going to make the playoffs after those games against Tampa, Carolina, and Florida. That happens again, they're done. But if they can hold their own this time, those games against Dallas to finish out the season could be key. But 8 of their final 10 games are against teams above the playoff line. So it's going to be really interesting to see how things go for Chicago. The only team they play that's currently below the line is Dallas. So they are done with Detroit. They are done with Columbus. It's a tough schedule for Chicago. We'll see what happens. So which teams end up making the playoffs in each division? Let me know in the comment section below. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. And just personally, I think the top 4 here, top 4 here, probably. St. Louis likely ends up replacing Arizona as 4th place. LA should be fun to watch, though. And Dallas probably knocks out Nashville, probably ends up in that 4th spot. And I have no idea how Dallas would do in a playoff series. But if it's against Carolina, based on their record against Carolina, it'd probably be over in 5. Probably not in Dallas's favor. But again, that's why they play the games. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.